Yeah, welcome to this talk that we have called From Legacy Chaos to the Promised Land of Domain-Driven Design. I'm Ellen. I'm the lead developer at Headshed, a startup company in Norway delivering intelligent sales systems. I've also worked at Statoil with Anita. I fell in love with domain-driven design about 10 years ago. And 5 years later, behavior-driven development came kind of sneaking into my life, and I've been really passionate about both of them ever since.
Yes, hello, and I'm Anita. I'm working at Statoil. I have a technical education, and I always think that coding has been fun to work with, but my real passion has been user experience and UX stuff. From the late 90s and until some years ago, my main role in the project has been a lot of related to business analyst stuff, a lot of related as a user experience person. And I read the famous DDD book in 2004. And it makes sense to me from the start. But it was really when I, 2-3 years ago, jumped back into coding again that I really fell in love with it.
So, our story. For the last 2 years now, we have been working on gradually modernizing a large and complex business-critical application in Statoil. The application is about 20 years old and a real giant. So we wanted to use ideas from domain-driven design and behavior-driven development to rewrite this giant piece by piece until we reached this promised land that we're talking about. It has been a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, but also a lot of fun. So we would like to share with you now our experience that we have had so far, both the sunny parts and the rainy parts.
Yeah. And to give a bit of context for the story we are sharing with you today, I will briefly introduce Statoil. Statoil is a multinational energy solution company with more than 21,000 employees worldwide. It has its headquarters in Norway. It has its main footprint in the oil and gas industry and is the world's largest offshore operator. It has played a special role because it's marketing and selling the Norwegian government gas shares, and it's the second largest gas exporter to Europe. The more recent year, it also started to work with more new energy solutions, and it's the major owner of the first world offshore wind farm. And the solution that we are going to talk about today is Energy Boss. It has its core related to gas handling, and it's a back office solution. You can, on a very high level, you can divide it into two pieces. One is invoicing focused, and what you do there is to classify the gas based on a lot of secret rules, and these secret rules actually come from the paper-written contracts. And then you have the prices, and you make the invoices. And it sounds so simple that it's boring and not the DDD stuff at all, but I will promise you the rules related to the gas handling agreement are nothing but they are not boring at all. And the second part of the solution is more financial services focused. It makes the detailed transactions to be sent to Statoil's central accounting solution. And here is, of course, important to have correct rules related to the amount, but it's also a lot of rules related to quantity. It must be possible to prove that no gas has disappeared. And in addition, it has a core functionality related to splitting all income and all costs between Statoil and the Norwegian government, since Statoil has this special role, as I mentioned, to take care of the gas shares the government owns. And in addition to have the contracts related to sale of gas, it has the sale of the electricity from the wind farms, and it has all the cost contracts related to that. It's the transportation, storage, and things like that. So, since Statoil has this specific role, buying an off-the-shelf solution is not a possible option. So Energy Boss is an in-house made solution where the first line of server-side code was written around 1993. Take a minute to think about that. Some of those lines of code are still running and giving valuable functionality for the user. And that's a long time ago. My teenage daughter back home wasn't even born, and the solution has been constantly enhanced all the years from the very start. Around year 2000, it was a major upgrade of the solution. It went from a terminal-based user interface into a graphical-based user interface implementing Visual Basic. And for that project, we did try to avoid touching the server side. You might have heard something like this, you know, the server is working, don't go close to it, keep it away. So that was the strategy back then. And the last 6 years, we have implemented some new screens in C#, but still the majority of screens are in Visual Basic. So, what started out as a cute little angel helping our user in their task has been constantly adding and adding on functionality, has become huge. But it's still a very valuable solution for our users. And that is an important point here, I think, that even though we have a lot of legacy on the technical side, the solution has been able to cope with the changing need in the business. And even though we started this journey, it was a good solution for the users. And then on the server side, we use a language, it's a 4th-generation language called Gen. I would assume that nobody knows about it. And that language is really tightly coupled to the database. It's so tightly coupled that you select the name of the tables in a menu when you write the code. So that's how you write the code. And you can think about how easy is it to refactor things and restructure things in an environment where the only option you have is more to select from a menu that gives you valuable option. That isn't easy at all, so it's really tangled together. And then we were very good in reusing code, because that was a good thing to do. So we made small functionalities that we reuse kind of all over the place. And of course, that means if we change it one place, we need to regenerate. This is a 4th-generation language, so we need to generate it down to C code and then to make it run. So we need to regenerate the complete solution, and we need to test it. And well, I haven't mentioned that, but we have no automatically test coverage here. So the test demand is pretty enormous. So regression testing is not what I love most. So, on the good side, when our story started, it was already decided that we should use DDD, so we did not need to take that fight. And we had a team with persons working in the area for years, and they cooperated in a good manner. And that was really needed, because there was a lot of islands out there. Islands with functionality, not just known by 1 or 2 persons, and they were typical the ones that was able to change it. And we did a much more upfront design back then. And upfront design means handovers, and handover doesn't always work perfect. But as I said, we had this team, and we worked well together, and that is really important. And being good in upfront design and having this team, we managed to deliver. We had kind of 2 main deliveries every year, but for each delivery, it was about 2 weeks of testing, 2 weeks in the team. And then we got the business people in, and they needed to test it for 2 more weeks. So for me, that was the most boring part of the year. But wait a moment, I said that the business was actually quite happy, and we managed to deliver it. So why do we talk about this legacy chaos? Well, I need to click again. When on the one side we had these islands of functionality just known by a few persons, and we got this demand saying, you should be cross-functional, you have to work, everybody should be able to code, and you need to deliver things frequently to production. And we had this 4 weeks of testing. Well, when these 2 meet together, then the feeling of chaos appears. But that feeling motivated also for change, because it became quite clearly that what has worked in the past will not work in the future. And we were lucky, because there was a project. Oh, did I click too much? Yeah. There came a transition project. saying due to a risk assessment, it was decided that for the financial services, the server side of that part of the solution need to be moved from the GAN language to C#, and at the same time make a more modular solution. And that was good news for us. So in a way, we had a project, we had some money, and we had the opportunity. But how to make a team that has worked in the area for years, but wasn't so known in the DDD and BDD world to actually achieve what we wanted?
So this team consisted of about 10 people. And I came into this team as a lead developer about 2 years ago when this project started. And in the beginning, I thought that my main role was to lay out the new architecture and design for the others to follow. So that's what I did. I just told everyone how we now should write the code, and they all said yes, and they went back to do their work. Are you laughing? Don't you think it worked? So when I came back and looked at the code afterwards, the design choices that had been made and the architecture, it wasn't really what I thought I had explained. So I soon discovered that changing architecture and code isn't really about changing architecture and code. It's about the people, the individuals and the interactions. It's about helping people change habits, to mentor and teach new skills. But most of all, to walk the line together, doing this change together as a team, not being one person going ahead and think that the other ones would follow. Changing people is much harder than changing code, but also a lot more interesting. I learned so much about people during this transformation, about my team members. I learned how very different they are when it comes to personalities and learning styles. For instance, one person in this team preferred to be told in quite detail what to do, and she enjoyed having a more experienced programmer sitting next to her, especially when doing new things. Another team member would rather try out the new things by herself. And if I did the same thing to her, trying to sit next to her, that would only make her stressed, and she wouldn't really learn anything. What she did like, though, was to have someone to look over her code afterwards, giving her tips on what she could have done differently and why. But again, when I did the same thing to another person in the team, trying to give him tips afterwards, he got mad and felt that I was just criticizing all his work. So what he preferred was to have more upfront collaborations, discussions, and then being trusted that he would write the code in a good way. So I had to learn all these things about the team members to be able to work with them in a good way. And I did some mistakes along the way. I hurt other people's feelings, and my feelings got hurt. But eventually, the whole team, we learned these things about each other, and we learned how to work together and utilize each other's strengths in a good way. And for me, this, what I call relational learning and the change in the relationships, was the most inspiring about this transition project. Maybe the most challenging task for the developers of this team was the change from a data-centric mindset to a more feature-centric mindset. A task that I often like to compare with that of changing from a geocentric view of the universe to a heliocentric view of the universe. So nowadays, no one questions that it is the Earth that revolves around the sun. But when Copernicus introduced this idea in the 16th century, it took the population 100 years to accept the fact that the Earth was not the center of the universe. the mindset change in this team did not take that long, but it might have been equally hard and painful. Because they were used to this universe, like Anita said, where the database really was the center of everything. It was the truth and the starting point for everything. And now they had to shift their minds to think more about the behavior of the system, the functionality, and the data was just kind of a side product of that. And that's not an easy shift to do. So to help me and the team in this process, I would like to thank a person called Julie Lerman. Have you heard about her? Her insights and articles about domain-driven design for the data-driven mind has been really helpful, both for giving us tips on how to do this transformation, but also for helping me understand which parts of domain-driven design are really hard when you're used to putting the data in the center. I strongly believe that when you are to learn new things, it's good to learn it in very many different ways. To read it and write it and hear it. Try to use all your senses in the learning process. So one of the things that we did was using role play. We actually had the whole team play out a gas sales algorithm in 2 versions. First as a transaction script, and then using domain-driven design, just to really feel the difference between these 2 approaches. So each team member played out a different class with responsibilities and knowledge, and they had to collaborate to fulfill the task of the algorithm. And this collaboration looked different in these 2 scenarios. It was mostly for fun, of course, probably a bit embarrassing for some, but still a bit of learning. And you know, when you have strong emotions, like joy or embarrassment, that's when you remember. You won't forget that. And I know that some people in the team, they still use this experience to help them to design their code. We did other things too, to increase the DDD knowledge of the team. And one of the things that kind of surprised me was that the people who grasped these ideas the first were not the most experienced programmers, but rather the more soft-skilled people, kind of like Anita. So this tells me that DDD isn't really a technical programming skill. It's much more a mindset thing. But it is a mindset that will form your code in a certain way.
So I can say a bit about my learning journey. As I said, I have a background in the usability area. And I think that helped me a lot, because it was easy to fall in love with DDD and really believe in its power. Because in the usability area, we had this model that stated if you manage to provide the functionality through a model in the user interface that is similar to the user's mental model, you are more likely to get a usable solution. So that if we also use this user's mental model of the business to actually make how we code, it makes sense that that will be a better solution. So for me, DDD was just UX for us that actually implement the solutions. And as I said, we had this demand that we wanted every person in the team to do some coding. So we started out with study groups. And that was a good way to learn the basic, to learn how to structure the code inside of the context. But as always, to get real learnings, you need real challenges and real problems. So then it was so great to work inside a modern context with all this automatically test support around it, because it's just a safety net. It's this safety feeling that the keynote speaker was talking about today. So it was so much easier than when we had pair programming and when I tried to do stuff myself and when Ellen mentoring me, that I was inside this modern context. So it helped me a lot to be able to jump into there and actually contribute to the production of the solution much faster. And I think for new team members, because we have taken on board some new team members not knowing the business, but knowing the technical stuff, it also helped them to become up and running faster since we have this bonded context. So the safety net, I love that. And when we did this design, as I said, we had more people in the team, and we need to know the business. Everybody knows that. If you're doing DDD, you need to know the business. So what we did was to have workshops with the users. And we also did something that probably sounds really strange. We read a lot of legacy code. So why did we do that? Well, we were going to implement a calculation with rules that has kind of appeared the last 20 years. So if you ask the users, could you give me the rules, please? Of course, I can't do that. It's an impossible task. But our users are able to confirm a rule, and we could discuss the rules, and we can understand the high-level part of it. But the details rules, we actually read legacy code. So that was how we found out the requirements. And then when it comes to high-level design, we try to engage the whole team together to decide what bonded context do we need, how big should they be, what is the responsibility, what aggregates to have inside them, how should they communicate with other bonded contexts. So that was really important to engage the whole team and really use some time there. And we think that was time well spent. And also, if you get it wrong the first time, it's a place where you should redo things because it's so important to get the correct boundaries. When it comes to the structure inside a bonded context, we had the onion architecture guiding us, so we didn't need to use a lot of discussions there. We used pair programming and code review to look out for each other, so none of the business rules slipped out from the domain model, but the rest kind of goes quite easily. And then we use this feature test, and let me tell you a lot about that soon. So we picked the features, and coming from my background, you know, all this waterfall project, all that stuff, I really love that part. You might have a calculation with at least 100 features, and then you pick just one of them, and you start implementing it. You don't need to think about all the others. And I think this pattern, I'm sure you all know it. You take one feature, you make it work, and then you pick another one, and you might refactor in between. That is a common pattern. But for us, that had a tool that always has kind of forced us to implement a complete calculation at once, for me it was a lightning moment to understand it's okay to write some code and know will not be the final code, and it's okay to restructure it or refactor it if I get a better insight with feature 2, and still the code in the end might be a better piece of code made easier and with less time than if you try to be perfect at the start. So, will you tell us something about the feature test?
I would love to. You probably got the idea now that we have been using domain-driven design and behavior-driven development. And the combination of these two we have found extremely powerful. And I'm not biased at all when I say that. I'll try to explain why, but I like to take a step back first and make sure that we are kind of on the same page when it comes to behavior-driven development. So I'll start by asking how many of you know what test-driven development is? And you're laughing. Do you also develop your code in a test-driven way? Not that many, but still some. And then, how many of you do behavior-driven development? And do you think there is a difference, or do you know the difference between test-driven development and behavior-driven development? Yeah. Okay. I'll still say some words about it. So I think there are a lot of ways to try and explain what behavior-driven development is. And one of them is to say that it's based on test-driven development. But it's more. Some people say that BDD is TDD done right. So what does that mean? Well, I think if you do pure test-driven development, and you know you have this red-green refactor cycle, that's known for all of you. And in this red part, you are focusing on writing the failing test so that you can write some production code to make this test pass, or green, and then refactor it afterwards. The thing is that this might become very technical, and you can push away your business experts when you're focusing on this test thing. So I think that's where behavior-driven development comes in, trying to be different. So instead of focusing on the T, the test, it focuses on the B, the behavior, just a change of letter. But what it means, though, is that really you are focusing on the behavior of your system, the functionality of your system, not how to test it, but what it is supposed to do. And you are doing that by describing examples or using examples. And also, like Anita has mentioned already, you do that together with the business experts, the testers, the developers, as a design process thing. And you don't have to be technical at all doing this. You can use whiteboard or sticky note or spreadsheets or whatever works for you to work out these examples. But it is very common and also a good idea to try and to describe these examples in some executable code. And with BDD, you usually use this, some kind of framework or tool that supports the Gherkin syntax. Do you know this syntax? Yes. Yeah. So I won't say that much about it. But so the purpose then is to get this good understanding of what the system is supposed to do. And with this feature test written with the Gherkin syntax, you have both a living documentation of your application and you have the safety net of the tests, automated tests. So what does this have to do with domain-driven design? Well, in my opinion, at least two important things. And the first one, the most obvious one, is that when you do this process of describing the behavior with the people that speak the same language, you will probably use ubiquitous language. That's a good way of discovering your domain model. So they work very well together in that sense. But also, since finding a good domain model is not a destination, it's a journey. As you gain insight and the business change, the domain model should change too. So you will constantly be refactoring it. And then the tests that you have, automated tests that you have created in your BDD process will have you covered so that you don't break anything. So this is at least some way these two concepts work very well together. Now, to get even more out of this nice symbiosis, I think it's a good idea to focus on your test strategy. So I would like to say some words about that too. So when it comes to testing, there are some challenges. And even with the best intentions, I think it's easy to mess it up. A lot of people think that the more tests you write, the better. But when you do that, you get a lot of code, which also needs to be maintained, just like the production code. And in my experience, these tests, instead of helping, they just get in my way when I want to refactor and work on the code. They make me feel stuck in the code, and I find that very frustrating. On the other hand, writing none or very few tests, which none of you do, but I've heard some other people who do that, would of course make me nervous when releasing. And I would not have the confidence to not do a lot of manual regression testing, which is boring, tedious. A type of test that I often see are lots and lots of tiny, tiny unit tests. And you can have 100% test coverage just by testing every unit completely and separately. It doesn't make me less nervous, though, because how do I know that all these units work together the way they should? So maybe the answer is having these huge integration tests, testing everything. Well, that kind of brings me back to the feeling of being stuck, because I find it hard to change anything when all my tests depends on everything. But then you have mocks and mocking frameworks, which makes it easier to test part of your code. I'm really scared of mocks. They make me feel that I lose control over what I'm testing. Am I testing the production code, or am I just testing the mock? I'm not sure. So, how to find a good balance for automated testing? In my opinion, a lot of projects does not give this enough attention, and they end up doing a little bit of everything, giving what I think of as a quite messy test regime that might look kind of like this. So if this is your system with all your classes or modules, and you might have a test over there mocking out some parts of the system, another one over there mocking out another part, maybe a little unit test in there, another test over there, and so on. We thought about our test architecture, and it looks different. This is what we did, and I think it worked really well. So we had a test strategy that was closely related to our bounded context. So if you have one bounded context over there and another one here, and they communicate with each other through an anti-corruption layer. They also read and store data in the database through the repository. Our strategy was to put all the tests at the top of our bounded context, at the feature level. We aimed at having no test in the middle at all, except for maybe a few unit tests. And the only places we would mock out anything would be at the border of the bounded context and at the repository for performance reasons, actually. With this strategy, we got feature focus. Since we had all the tests at the top, they were all focusing on the features, the behavior that our users were expecting from the code. And we got 100% test coverage of those features because every line of code in that context that would contribute to that feature were being tested from the same point. No fakes, no mocks, all the code involved is being tested. This actually gave us more confidence than having lots of tests all over the place. And they were not like huge end-to-end integration tests since we were cutting them off at the border. So in that way, of course, changes in another context would not affect the tests in this context. So we had to write and use some mocks. But it was limited because they were all placed at the same place in a context, and all the tests in one context would use the same mock. So it was not that bad. What I loved the most about this strategy, though, was that it enabled us to do all kinds of crazy refactoring. Since we had this test at the top that made sure that we didn't break anything, and no test in the middle. So when doing refactoring, we didn't have to refactor any tests. All the code changes were about production code. Yeah. I forgot again. Sorry. Because this was important to me, so I wanted to have all my points. Yeah, that was the one I was going to say. So when doing this refactoring, we could always keep our code optimal with regards to the changes in requirements from the business. But now, most of all, the feeling it gives to be able to work with the code this way, to mold it and twist it and change it in every possible way. It's such a freedom. It's so powerful. It makes me really happy while coding.
Yeah, I know you are very happy about this feature test.
Yes.
I'm too, because this feature test is my safety net, as I was talking about. And being kind of jump back to programming again to get into that safety net, it was fantastic. But I think we need to go on and say some more about our journey to the promising land of DDD. So, another topic that is interesting is how do we split this giant, this monolithic application? And I'm sure you all know this. It's just, to carve out the correct pieces, and then you take one piece, and you have to throw it into the correct bonded context. And when you have done that, since this is domain-driven design, everything will work. Of course. No, just kidding. It is hard. It is hard to do something, to do changes when a monolith needs to be up and running all the time. It's like if you renovate your house. Okay, if you move away for a year and you come back, it's much easier. But if you're living in it and you demand the same level of comfort during the complete process, that is hard. And our user was going to use our solution every day, so it had to be up and running from the very start. So what we decided was that we use our database as the integrator. So we put the rainy part in the database. Everything will not be perfect, but at least we know where we kind of pick the poison and put it there. Meaning that we had in the invoicing part of the solution, there was some screens that also pick information from the financial services part, and they need to find the information on the same place so we don't break anything. And we put that in the database. But for the new bonded context, it still has to read just its own data, and of course, just to change its own data, so we follow the rules there. Something that really was important for us in our achievement was to exploit feature toggles. So I want to share a bit about how we have used that with you. I don't know if everybody uses feature toggles here. I used to compare it with, what you see in the train stations, when you can switch the train to go to one direction or the other direction, and you can switch it back and forth as many times as you like. So this switch, or the toggle, we exploited a lot. Is there a lot of people using that in their own project? Yeah, there are some. So, for instance, we have one scenario. We were implementing a calculation that was mainly living in context A. It was a quite huge calculation, and it needed a split number from context B, and that should also be calculated. And since our team owned both of these contexts, we had planned to do this kind of together. But then the business, they're always the business. They started to discuss the rules related to calculating the split key. And they actually needed some months to decide upon that. So what do we do? Should we just stop writing the calculation in context A? No, we said, okay, we put a feature toggle that in the start just make the split key split number coming from the legacy code. And then we can complete the calculation in this context A. And we could put that into production, and the user could start using it. And then, when they 2 months later come back to us and said, okay, we have decided now, these are the rules, then we just implemented it in the context B, and we made the switch. So it gives us a lot of, not so depending on the users and the business. And in this case, we knew that the rules that we were hoping for and was more likely to be the end of it would give a much more simpler domain model. So it was a point not to just start implementing the complex rules when we were expecting much more simpler rules to come. So that was in one situation. And then we have another situation. We have a lot of calculation that is actually manually triggered by the users from the user interface. So what we do when we start on these huge calculations are that we put a feature toggle in on the client side, so we can just point to the legacy code from the start. That means that the bounded context where we are starting to implement a calculation that is far from finished, we can still put that out to production, because that part of the code will not be called. And in this case, as you see on the figure, we have more than one feature toggle. So what we did, we had this calculation, and we know that we do this for the cost contracts first. So the feature toggle in the client was one for the cost contracts, and it was another for the gas sales contracts. So why did we do that? Well, the sales contracts demand much more functionality. So we did the limit set of functionality, and we managed the users to start using that for the cost contract. And that was a positive effect from them too, because they didn't need to kind of take the new calculation for all their contracts at once. We managed to do a stepwise implementation, and that felt good for IT. And for the business, it felt good not to take everything at once. And this, just this calculation, it was related to calculating this data transaction that should be sent to the Statoil central accounting solution. And to do this, we have this template which the user actually are configuring in our solution. So when we were working with them, because yes, we read the legacy code, but we talk with the users a lot, and we try to ask them, if you know things we should change now when we go from this monolithic application to the promised land of DDD, please tell us so we can do something that really gives you a better solution to. So they said, we need some enhancements in our templates. So we put a new feature toggle towards the database. So first we implemented the calculation based on just the functionality from the old template. And then we enhanced the calculations, and we could switch it to use the new template with the enhanced functionality. So altogether, this possibility to do parts and to turn on the feature toggles in the testing environment, still not having them in production, and all that stuff is helping us with the demand for delivering code to production often. And we also want that every time we check in the code, it should be possible to deliver that into production. And we couldn't do that without having the feature toggles. And it all started out this way, more switching between the legacy code and the new code. But as the team started to use it more and more, we also use it if we refactor, do some bigger refactoring in the new code. We can put feature toggles, and we can all the way know which part of the code are actually going to be called and which one is just there and we need to activate it. So to summary a bit, this makes it possible to build this functionality step by step. That was really important. And we were also independent of user availability. And that sounds quite stupid, I think, because we are there for the users. So if they don't want to use our solution or the functionality, why are we doing this? But it's not like that. It's not like we want to shift something into production that the user doesn't need. But our users are financial persons. And have you tried to ask a financial person when it's, they are doing their quarterly report or more or less yearly report and say, I have some code here you should test? Of course, that doesn't work. They have some periods that are not able to do a UAT, for instance, and then we need this flexibility. And also for the template that they have asked for, they need to configure those in production before we can start using them. And that also takes some time so that they were able to test it and they know that the functionality was what they wanted. But they could use some time to set it up into production, and we can activate it when they are ready. That's a really good thing. So we managed to deliver more frequent, and I think delivering frequent, the most important there is actually to get this continuous learning all the way, to get the feedback. So feature toggles was important for us. And I think there's one thing too that is often kind of overlooked. We actually managed to embrace our legacy solution. So we have this monolith, and we wanted to replace part of it, so we could just start running away from it. But instead, we were thinking, what can our legacy solution do for us? And it was quite a bit. One thing was that you had a perfect fallback solution. When you had this feature toggle, since we could have the legacy calculation and the new calculation up and running in parallel for an interim period, since we are implementing the new servers in a new platform, we could have them up both at the same time. And of course, when we deliver something into production, we could always switch the feature toggle back. A safety net that we haven't needed it yet, but still it feels good for us and for the users. And then we have the data, the legacy data, and that is, of course, gold. And for us, we don't have this kind of, it isn't big data or huge data, but it was more than enough to be useful. So what we did was that we said to ourselves, well, we have all these transactions that have been calculated with the old legacy code, and that is the code they want us to now build once more. So we can just compare it. So we made automatically tests that run on the legacy data, and we compared the calculation done by the new calculation with the calculation done by the legacy code. And if it wasn't any mismatch there, we were quite confident that we have picked the correct requirement and that we have implemented it correctly. Because, of course, we trust the feature test, but do we trust that we have written all the feature tests correctly the first time? We can't do that. So this was when we delivered something the first time. And since we are able to do this automatically, we could just first run it for the cost contract, and then we plan to run it for like a sales contract when we enhance the calculation to also cover those types of contracts. But we stopped and we said, okay, reading this legacy code, it gives us the rules, and most of the feature is quite easy to spot and figure out, but there is also some feature that is more hidden. And we don't want to use a lot of time reading this code and reading the code to be sure that we haven't missed something. So we said, let's implement what we spot easily, all those features. And then we start to run the comparison test. And every time the test didn't match, we knew there was a requirement we haven't picked up yet. So we used that actually to find the last set of requirements. And that saved money, but more money and time and money, that's kind of the same thing. And when we save that, but more important, it feels so much safer actually to have done all this testing on the legacy data. So that is really recommended if you do a solution, something similar to us. And of course, we exploited both the calculations in the old solution, we exploited the data, but we also exploited all the knowledge we in the team has got during the years of working with the legacy solution. So it was much easier to set the correct boundaries and to define the correct boundary context than if we had done a greenfield implementation. So all to all, the legacy application isn't that bad to have, even though it's hard to. I admit that.
Those are so many nice things that you mentioned here, Anita, that this team has achieved. It's really great. But I've been wondering, did we really reach this promised land of domain-driven design yet? You see, I'm a bit of a perfectionist. And when doing this transformation, I wished for everything to be perfect. And it was, of course, not always like that. And this was actually one of my most important learnings, I think, for me personally, was this: it doesn't have to be perfect. It's still good. Every little improvement makes a difference. It doesn't have to be perfect. And I keep still saying that to myself, but I think I will believe it very soon. Now, having said that, there are, of course, hundreds of reasons for things not becoming perfect. And for us, one of them was that old habits are hard to change. So even if we knew the right way of doing things, occasionally we would fall back into the old way of doing things, like putting data in the center. But we would notice this, though. And sometimes we would go back and change it, but not always. But still, we would learn from it and try to do better the next time. Another reason was one that Anita has already mentioned, that we were rewriting this software piece by piece while still living in it, so we had to interact with the legacy code. And also, Energy Boss, like no other domains that I know of, is a very complex domain. I don't think any of your domains are. Just kidding. So sometimes it was hard to find elegant solutions, even for new stuff, just because it was very complex. But this too could be for the good, because we would sometimes, instead of spending a lot of time trying to find this very nice solution for a very complex piece of our software, we would go back and ask our users if they really needed this complexity. And very often the answer was no. Often they didn't even know that it was there. So we could just remove it altogether, giving a solution that was easier to use and understand for our users, and code that was easier to use and understand for the developers. So even if things went perfect, there were so many good things that maybe we saw this promised land anyway.
Yeah, of course, everything isn't perfect, but I can promise you one thing, it's so much better than before. I really mean that. So, in many ways, we are there now, in the promised land of DDD. We are more people knowing the code, simply because we were working a lot more together. And if you don't know the code in one bonnet context, you can use the feature test to guide you into what is actually this bonnet context doing. And something like that we never had before. And we have also seen much, and of course, we can deliver much more frequently. And that was a goal for this project, and it was really important for us. And we see that since we have this safety nest, and since we feel safe, we are able to experiment with the code, and we are able to refactor it. And we have more than once added new requirement that has kind of felt in so easily in this legacy, in this new world. And we know how hard it was to do the kind of similar changes for the legacy code. So actually the possibility for doing new stuff makes me also look forward to the coming times with working in this DDD landscape, not just when we make it our first time. And then my favorite, no more 1 month of regression testing. That is so good. We are delivering into production often, and I'm really happy.
So we are coming to an end. So we'd like to wrap it up. We do have some things that we want you to remember when leaving this room. And it's this. It is possible to change a situation of bad code to a situation of good code. But in our experience, it starts with the people, the personalities and preferences. So we believe that when you know your team members, you know how they work, you know everything about them, that's when you can do great changes with your code. And when you do smart things with your code, you will not only increase the quality of the application, but you will also increase the motivation of the team members, which again will lead to even better code. And with good code, you will be able to serve your users in an almost perfect way. Now, good luck with your own journeys, and thank you so much for listening to us.
Thank you for sharing, because it resonates with my own experience, so I'm not feeling alone. That's a good thing. You mentioned something in the beginning that it was like decided that it was decided to do DDD and BDD. Who decided that and how?
Well, I wasn't part of that decision actually, but I think it was more like Statoil as a company, part of, there was some other solution too that was going into and should be rewritten. And then who actually said that we should do DDD, I don't know, but what I did was to get Eric Evans and fly him into Trondheim and give courses and so on. So it was really, I think it was really motivated in the team, but also from the management. So we had kind of started, but for our solution, it was parts that had been doing it, but we haven't kind of, I think when Ellen came in, we started to do it right. And I think that has a lot about the test strategy, actually. But so it was a bit from the management, but I have never seen, I haven't heard anyone saying we shouldn't do it, we don't like it. So I don't know all the details, sorry.
Yeah, hello, thank you for the talk. I have a question regarding your testing strategy. I use the same strategy like testing features. It's a kind of integration test. And I had a big problem that after some time one gets tests which are very slow. So if they are many, they can take an hour. And you basically lose the advantage of TDD short feedback cycles. So I don't know, did you experience similar problems with this strategy? Or?
Yes, agree on that they could get slow. And that was the reason, or the main reason for mocking out the repository, even though it is kind of part of the same context, to make it faster. But still, I think mostly because of the framework. I think we use SpecFlow, and I think SpecFlow just is a bit slow, so they were a bit slow. What we did, though, was that we, and probably a lot of people do the same thing, but we split the tests in the slow one and the fast ones, so that at least we can run the fast one first, and then we had this CI server that would run all the tests, so at least you would get the feedback, but maybe not as quick as you would hope for. But yeah, kind of the same problem.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I was wondering, you mentioned that you looked a lot at the legacy code also to learn from the existing systems. How did you guard, though, that you don't take all the negative baggage that is associated with the model in legacy system into your new greenfield situation? Do you have any strategies for that?
It's a very good question.
Yeah, it is. And it isn't, I don't know if it's a really easy answer. Of course, there's one thing to take the feature. As we said, some of the feature was so complicated that we really went back and asked, are you sure you need this? But I think some feature might have slipped into our domain even though it is needed. But when it comes to actually not writing the same way as the legacy code, that is kind of, we're trying to fight it by doing pair programming and code review, because it's easy to see this if-then-else nesting. And it's in there in the domain, but it's still that part. So that is just something we need to work with, and we are working with it. And it's a part of not always very perfect part. But I think the most important thing is that you are questioning, do you need it? And then, since we have this feature test, we can always refactor the part when we see, oh, here we have written the code a bit like trying to recreate the legacy code. So we don't let there be there for a long period. We try to refactor it.
Okay. And also, I want to add, I kind of like behavior-driven development. And I think when we tried to kind of force that, writing the tests first or the description first, and when we managed to do that, that helped. Yeah. Because then we would look at the code from a different angle. So instead of just looking at the other code and just copy the same and write it. So that helped. But of course we had challenges in having people think that way all the time.
Yeah, yeah. So I've had the experience that it really help. You can even have benefit already from thinking in terms of BDD, not even having it.
Yeah.
You know, your scenarios being executable tests.
Agree.
But at the same time, when you're thinking in BDD scenarios, you often see that you have the happy path first, and then a whole bunch of scenarios that actually never really happen.
Yeah.
But they all of a sudden seem more important than this one happy thing because it takes up like 80% of the document. So it's I guess difficult and something you have to address with team culture. Thanks.
So one question. We have time for one more question. Somebody else than you? Okay.
About the feature toggle, you mentioned also that in your migrations, you're using feature toggle for your migration strategy, and you're comparing the output of the old code against the new one. Did you ever run into the issue that actually the old code was wrong, and that the users went in all sorts of ways to get the output right, and so that you couldn't use this
Comparison
stuff?
Yeah, when we did this comparison test, we didn't use the feature toggles, just to be clear on that, because then that was kind of an integration test we run. But yes, we had sometimes it didn't give the same thing, and it was because the user has actually done a manual change after the calculation, but then we go into each one of those and understand the reason. And I think since we have this team and some of the members, quite a few of us have been there for a long time, we are able to do those things. And we can also see from the data if it has been manually amended. So we didn't bring that into the automatically test, but we did this. If it was different, we investigated in why. But still, it helped a lot.
Okay, thank you very much. Please don't forget to leave your feedback at the exit, and now you have the chance to enjoy coffee and cake downstairs. Thank you.
Thank you.